Hello and welcome to the Martial Arts and Humanities series. Today's program on immersion journalism is hosted by the Association of Martial Scholars in partnership with the Narrative Journalism Program at Denison University and the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute for Literary Reportage at New York University. And thanks to all for joining us today. My name is Margot Singer. For those who don't know me, I'm a writer and professor and currently the director of the Eisner Center for the Performing Arts at Denison University in Granville, Ohio. I also sit on the board of the Association of Martial Scholars, and I'm pleased to be hosting today's discussion with award-winning writer, journalist, and fellow Martial Scholar, Ted Conover. The Association of Martial Scholars, for those who don't know, works to strengthen US-UK ties and the Marshall Scholarship, which is a postgraduate fellowship program funded by the British government that since 1954 has sent top American students to pursue graduate degrees in the UK. So a special welcome to all Marshall alumni who are joining us today. Since the onset of the global pandemic, the AMS has hosted a monthly arts and humanities series featuring artists, poets, writers, and performers in conversations about their creative processes, inspirations, and ideas. Brief housekeeping notes, please share your questions in the Q&A box. I hope you'll share them at any time and have lots of them. And please keep in mind that today's event will be recorded or is being recorded, and the recording will be published to the AMS YouTube channel if you wish to share it with your friends. So it's a great pleasure and honor to be here in conversation with Ted Conover. Ted's a professor at NYU and the director of the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. He's the author of 6 books, including Newjack, Guarding Sing Sing, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, and many other publications. His most recent book is Immersion, a writer's guide to going deep. So since his college days, Ted Conover has gone out into the world in search of stories, hopping freight cars with railroad hobos, sneaking across the US-Mexico border with illegal immigrants, driving a taxi cab in Aspen, guarding criminals as a corrections officer in a maximum security prison, working as a USDA meat inspector, living off the grid. His books are exemplars of what's come to be called immersion journalism, reporting that takes us deep into places that are typically difficult or even impossible to access out of public sight. Like an ethnographer, he goes out to live among the people whose stories he tells, sometimes undercover, doing the work they do, really getting to know them, finding out what their lives are really like. So Ted, the introduction to your latest book, The Craft Guide, Immersion, starts off, for me, it started on a train, you write. I hopped it in the old Missouri Pacific Yard in St. Louis. And you were 22 years old, hopping on freight trains, taking a break from college, working on your senior anthropology thesis. And I'm just wondering if you can start by telling us, what point did you realize you were writing the book? And what was it about that experience that made you want to keep doing this over and over in different ways all these years?
Well, certainly when I was a college student and when I was writing the rails, I was not thinking about writing a book. That seemed beyond me. It seemed something professors or professional writers did. And I was an undergraduate doing thesis research and sort of controversial thesis research since it was not legal. And in fact, I had to take a leave from college in order to even do it. And then I came back and they said, oh, okay, now you can write your thesis about this. But I was in the habit of taking notes about my experiences and about other people from being a journalist and from a couple of creative writing courses where I'd written personal essay. And so I was thinking a lot about the experience the whole time I was having it. And after an article I wrote for a student publication got published by the alumni magazine at Amherst, people from outside started asking me, asking if I could be interviewed, could I be on their TV show? And that's when I thought, wow, maybe I actually could write a book about this. And that got exciting because the thesis had to be in the third person. That's how ethnographies were written back then. And the book was the chance to write it in the first person, which is what I'm most comfortable with and what I thought would be most enlightening for a story. So yeah, it was a sort of evolution. I certainly did not set out thinking I'd write a book.
That's the way most books seem to come into being. It seems like, you write, I'm most struck by one of the things you say in Immersion, that immersion writing is a special category because it says we can come to understand each other. You say talk a lot about empathy, and you quote the wonderful writer Alex Kotlowitz, who says empathy is, he calls it the centripetal force of both storytelling and community. And so the power of nonfiction immersive storytelling can in the end serve to connect us, to build community. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that aspect of immersion, well, of journalism in general and immersion writing in particular, the sort of empathy aspect of it, and where in your own work you've found those connections to building community or just to getting to know others kind of happen most powerfully.
So that to me is really one of the great advantages of this approach is you spend a lot of time with other people and people unlike yourself in various ways. And the challenge is A, to see if they'll let you spend that time with them. And then B, can you do it? I mean, it takes a lot of, you need some flexibility in your own life to be able to invest this time. And it's also sometimes the people I'm writing about are hard to be with. Maybe they drink a lot. Maybe they are just difficult people. And that kind of thing is also hard. But if I stick with it, I'm looking for ways to understand how life for them is different from life for me. And that, to me, is the fascination and the benefit of this, because it's like an identity experiment. I think that could have been me if I'd grown up a different way, if I'd been raised by different parents or no parents. I could have had a life like that. Would I have been able to manage? Could I manage now? Am I able to, cross the border with Mexican workers? Am I able to work in a prison? Could I do those things? And once you find yourself spending all this time with other people doing the exact same thing, you start to relate and empathize. It's kind of impossible not to, actually. Just spending time with people, it brings you into their space. And I find it's a wonderful leveler where, the qualifications that have let me think about doing something like writing a book take a back seat to the human qualities that let me engage with actual people who don't have letters after their names. And so I've always, thought education has empowered me, but it also creates this distance. And so immersion is trying to shrink that distance back down.
It seems like you were aware of that right from the start in looking to take, well, I guess you were sort of compelled to take a leave from college since they wouldn't let you do this while you were enrolled as a student. But just the very idea of the thesis topic of wanting to get out and get to know this segment, of the railroad hobos. To what extent was that motivated by those same feelings of wanting to sort of see what your life might have been like if you'd been born under very different circumstances, that kind of impulse?
So I'll just admit, I don't fully understand it. It's complicated. I was fascinated by anthropology because it seemed like journalism gone deep, that journalism off of this quick deadline that keeps you attending to, the 5 W's and interview style inquiry, and rather by putting yourself somewhere else, you learn so much more, and you actually have an experience that changes who you are, and you often get a story out of it, which, as you know, is a big deal if you're writing and hope to attract a more general audience, you need a sequence of events, and you need people who you might call characters. And it gave me all these things that that journalism didn't. So it's sort of along the way, I've just started to appreciate the various ways in which this is useful, and the pitfalls too. I mean, you have to be, there are all kinds of ethical issues involved in writing about other people, and all kinds of questions about how you need to comport yourself. Yeah,
for sure. Well, can you read to us a little bit? I know you have a short section picked out from, I think, Newjack.
yeah.
The time you spent at Sing Sing, the New York prison. Give folks a little bit of a flavor for your work who aren't already familiar.
Sure. So I moved to New York from Colorado when the incarceration crisis was, peaking, or really, really bad. And I thought, how could I write about this in a meaningful way? And ended up settling on the idea of becoming a corrections officer. And it was the first secretive project I'd done. I'm usually pretty open about who I am, what I'm doing in a place, but this had to be done secretly. So, about 6 weeks in, 6 months in, I was assigned a particular floor of a giant cell block in Sing Sing. And this is from that period of time. Larson's cell decor reflected his difference. Like so many other inmates, he had a dozen or so girly pinups on his wall, but his were conspicuously clothed. And they weren't white, but African-American, like him. He had a pile of cassette tapes, mostly hip hop, but he had a much taller stack of books. His Dictionary of Evolution, he told me, he'd bought from another inmate for a pack of cigarettes. There were volumes of Afrocentric history like the ones that are sold on the sidewalk in downtown Brooklyn, social science primers, and an academic survey of perceptions of race over the years. I'd stopped at his cell after he knew me a little and asked what he was reading. Here, he said, passing the book through the bars, read this page. The book was an old work of physical anthropology, and the passage was about the classification of Homo sapiens into different racial strains. Oh yeah, I said, they used to worry about this stuff a lot. Who? Anthropologists. Larson stared at me. What's your story, Conover? He asked a moment later. You're not like the other COs here. What do you mean? You mean because I'm not from upstate? No, it's something else. The way you think and the way you walk. My heart rate rose a bit, except for Dieter back at the academy. That was my bunkmate. My passage through the Department of Correctional Services had been blissfully free of anyone, officer or inmate, with the slightest interest about my background. Prisons were full of people who liked to talk more than they liked to listen, and lack of curiosity had been my friend. But Larson was smart and uncannily observant. You went to college, he asked? Yeah. And what did you study? Anthropology. Anthropology? That's a hard and deep subject. He stared at the wall for a moment. What are you doing here? You should be a teacher or something. I paused and swallowed. It was my feeling exactly, and I wanted to tell him so. Instead, I evaded by saying, life takes funny turns, Larson. You probably know something about that. How'd you end up here? It was his third bid, he said. After doing time for assault in Alabama, where he grew up, and a second sentence for weapons possession, he'd been in New York, dating a woman who was also dating a CO. He and the man had gotten into an argument in the lobby of her building. The CO had drawn his gun, but Larson had shot him first. Too many times, he said. And Larson had been sent back to prison with a sentence of 8 years to life. Conover, when I came into prison the first time, I couldn't read or write. Apart from prison literacy courses, he said, he was entirely self-educated. Instead of wasting so much of the inmates' time on recreation, Larson thought, Sing Sing should put a small library on every gallery so that inmates could sit in their cells and read. He passed me a couple of dog-eared photocopies from radical journals that decried the huge social resources being devoted to imprisonment. $35 billion a year in the United States and growing despite the drop in violent crime. You could feel the rush of prison growth even in the forgotten backwater of Sing Sing, where the superintendent had said that getting money to build new and bigger vocational shops was his #1 priority. I'd die to stop that, Larson said to my surprise. You don't want to see this place improve? No. The money should all be put back into the poor neighborhoods, back into education for children, to change the things that send people here. He held out the articles he'd loaned me. You read these, right? I nodded. And tell me, Conover, if I understand correctly, it says here in this article that the government's planning right now for the new prisons they're going to need in 10 or 12 years. I got that right? Again, I nodded. That's wrong. What's wrong with planning ahead? Because dig this, anyone planning a prison they're not going to build for 10 or 15 years is planning for a child, planning prison for somebody who's a child right now. So you see, they've already given up on that child. They already expect that child to fail. You heard? Now why, if you could keep that from happening, if you could send that child to a good school and help his family stay together, if you could do that, why are you spending that money to put him in jail? I had no answer for Larson. He'd made me feel dumb in my uniform, like a bozo carrying out someone else's ill-conceived plan. But he didn't act as if I were to blame. Hey, he said by way of goodbye, next time you're back, bring me a couple of theories to talk about.
Thank you. That's an amazing scene. It makes me think about how, I mean, in any reporting work, but especially in a long-term role like the one you were playing at Sing Sing, you have to negotiate this line between being the reporter and the observer and being, really an active participant in the story as it's evolving. And I wonder, how did you have to negotiate that ethical line, if you want to call it that, in that project? Were there moments where it was particularly challenging?
The hardest thing about it was not being able to share the experience or the stress with people outside of my family and 1 or 2 friends. That was the hardest part, because that's when you could really use your friends, is when you're in a situation like that,
Right.
which is super stressful. Not just, it's physically stressful. You worry about getting hurt, and it's psychologically stressful because you're doing something so negative. But it seemed worthwhile because every day I'd learn something I figured I wouldn't have another way of knowing if I weren't there. So yeah, normally you tell the people you're writing about that you're there to write about them. That is the default position for ethnography or journalism or anything else. Secrecy is, a last resort, and lots of places say you just can't do it. But it seemed to me there's a small number of cases where it's really important that people know more about this, and the only way is to sneak in. So I don't know, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, I'm sure, and I'm sure it's different in different projects. Do you think you'll do another undercover? Are you doing an undercover project now? Will you do
No,
because Google, right? Like anyone can find out who you are in a second.
Yeah, I've got to say, serial secretive projects have just gotten harder and harder. Google was just becoming real common when I was researching Newjack, and I'd been waiting 3 years to get the job and doing other freelance work. I was so scared. I had a cover story in the New York Times Magazine come out the second month I was working at Sing Sing. I was just certain someone was going to confront me. And that was so naive because nobody there reads the New York Times.
I don't know if I should laugh or cry about that, but yeah, wow. Are there other tensions though relating to that sort of ethical question about the fact that you're sort of living this life as a corrections officer or whatever you're doing. But you go home at night, right? You can
Yeah.
exit that life at any time.
Oh, yeah. So a really important part of this is to be very modest in your claims of what you can know. So when I was riding freight trains, I had a beloved aunt who had sent me off from New Jersey, who I called collect partway through, just because I was so lonely. I wanted to talk to somebody. But the very act of calling her collect was something that a real railroad tramp probably couldn't do. And when she heard from me, she said, "Oh, this is great. You're a hobo now." And I was like, no, I'm not. And in fact, I don't think you could be if you had not authentically experienced homelessness. That you couldn't know. And in fact, it's a kind of knowledge I was kind of glad not to know, because I kind of think understanding homelessness firsthand is a kind of wound that I was not interested in having inflicted. And so, no, I could have walked off the job at Sing Sing any day. I could have called my parents for a bus ticket home from rural Montana any day. So I go to great pains to say this is not the story of corrections officers. This is the story of my attempt to do that job. And I didn't always do it very well. Like the curiosity that comes from education gets in your way in prison, because it makes you out of place if you're asking questions or even having questions. The job's much easier if you're not curious. So there's all kinds of ways in which most of the people around me did a better job than me, I think. And so that's just one other piece of advice. If anyone else is considering something like this, is you kind of have to flip, like, professor-student relationship and make them the teacher. They know what I want to learn. So I need to be open to everything they can teach me. Now, it's not to say that I forget everything I already know, and keeping a little distance there is what lets you write the book, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of my favorite pieces is the Outside magazine piece you wrote, 30 years after riding the rails. You went back and did it with your son, Asa, who was then 18 years old. And you talk about, the fear that he might fall off and hurt himself, a fear, of course, you don't think of when you're 19 or 20 doing it yourself. I have to say, having reread that book recently as, an adult, and I know that you survived, as one does when you read a book, but I almost always found myself worrying about you.
Thank you.
And, I realized that you're not, in a war zone, that there are more dangerous reporting jobs out there, but still, it seems like many of the situations you've immersed yourself in are intense, if not downright scary. And I wonder, what was the most challenging situation that you found yourself in over the years?
Oh, you're right. Like going back on the rails with my son was a completely different experience, because I had to worry about him. It's one thing just worrying about yourself.
Right.
To worry about your kid is a big deal. And but it reminded me that when I was doing it by myself, one of the scariest parts was just having to go to sleep at night in the company of people I didn't know. And it might be at a hobo campground on the edge of a freight yard, or it might be on a train car going 50 miles an hour. And at a certain point, you have to fall asleep. And, when you're awake, you can defend yourself by staying sober and away from the door or whatever. But we all have to sleep. And so that was one of the scariest parts.
Yeah.
And then I guess just prison is just it's a very macho place, and there's a lot of posturing, and there's a lot of physical prison is about physical compulsion. It's about locking up people in little boxes and using your own physical presence to manage them. And I'm not as big as most of these guys. And so it's a bit of bluster where you just have to act like you're Superman and you're not going to get hurt, but you're never sure.
And you do get punched at one point.
I did.
Not fun. I wonder if immersion journalism is particularly difficult work for female journalists. I mean, there's wonderful writers, Barbara Ehrenreich, Anne Fadiman, Catherine Boo, Susan Orlean, but it does seem, I was teaching a travel writing course a few years ago. It was hard to find books to assign by women writers. And there are many of the experiences you've had that I wouldn't go there.
Well, there's now, there's some good collections of writing by female travel writers. There's one by Mary Morris, I think, called Maiden Voyages. There's more and more.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of situations. Travel writing is a kind of immersion writing. And there are other kinds, like Suki Kim's book about teaching in North Korea is an amazing example of a woman putting herself at risk in order to write about it. And she taught children of the elite in a religious school. And so, yeah, there's lots of examples. I can't really explain what made me want to work in a prison or do some of these other things, but immersion does not have to be about taking physical chances.
Right, of course. Ashley has a question. She asks if your view of telling a story has evolved at all as new platforms and formats evolve, podcasts, videos, data visualizations, and so on, or do you feel the printed word, magazines, books, and the more classic storytelling formats are more conducive to this form of reporting?
The printed word has great advantages when it comes to the reporting or research phase, because you don't need to march in with a camera or a recorder. You can you keep your eyes and ears open and pay attention. But it has disadvantages when it comes to reaching a larger audience, right? So, video is so powerful, and podcasting is just opening up our minds to such a diverse world of humanity. I just listened to a podcast last week by a meth and heroin addict in the part of Colorado where I'm working. It's really impressive. It's rough. It's not professionally produced, but the fact that this person made it is so important and interesting. So I guess I'd just say, I could not have written Newjack or had that conversation with Larson with a camera on my shoulder or a microphone in his face. I don't think it would be a different thing. Not that it wouldn't. He'd still be a great person to interview. He's back in Brooklyn now. We're in touch, and I'm sure he'd be open to some sort of media interview, but
it changes the relationship.
It does,
right? Yeah.
The conditions in which something was learned change the outcome as well. Yeah.
It's interesting. Shifting a little bit, obviously the last 4 years have been a wake-up call for a lot of people as to the importance of high quality journalism and also the difficulties that we face in making that happen. It spoke to the need when Trump was first elected, for coastal reporters to get out of their bubbles, to pay attention to life outside the big cities. Here at Denison, we've hosted the Between Coast Forum, a series of gatherings of journalists looking to figure out how to do a better job of covering those stories that the big coastal news outlets maybe got wrong or don't know about. And in so many ways, local reporters are immersed in their communities, right, in a way that reporters who parachute in can never be. But local newspapers are being, decimated by decades of eroding ad sales and cutbacks and mergers. What are your thoughts on? I mean, not that you have a solution to this huge problem, but just thoughts on how to address that gap and if there's a role that immersion writing can play.
Well, I like to think there is. After the election of Donald Trump, and which was such a surprise to the people I work with in media in New York, and I think probably most journalists in the country, it just was undeniable that there's a big bubble around coastal media, especially, that it needs to be burst, or that needs to, there's a membrane there that needs to go away. And that's what prompted me to begin this project I've been working on in rural Colorado, where most people voted for Trump, and which initially I could not understand at all. I now understand it better. And, but, the actions of somebody, I mean, I like to think this new project I'm working on will address what you're talking about, but it's obviously not a systemic cure. You can't, even if you got 24 writers to go out and do immersion projects in the Midwest or rural areas, or Staten Island for that matter, you wouldn't solve the problem you've just brought up. So I think it's a corrective, but it's not enough. Yeah.
It does seem to me to be one of the only ways, though, to get past that sort of barricade of, I just don't get it, that feeling, right?
Yeah.
That both sides seem to have. I read an interview recently, a woman whose children were trying to get her to stop watching, all these, conspiracy theory news outlets, or whatever you want to call them, media outlets. And she's quoted as saying, I'm so worried about my children. They're reading the New York Times. They just don't get it, and they're like, oh my God, what is wrong with mom? So that complete misunderstanding. And it does seem to me that it takes a longer form than a news story to start to get at that.
Yeah, like something I do in my classes is just focus on getting people to pay attention to where information came from. So you read it. Okay, where? And if it was on Facebook, okay, but what was the source on Facebook? And I just think the majority actually of Americans don't pay attention to the source beyond it being on Facebook. And as we all know, that the algorithms at Facebook serve you up things you're likely to believe and feel good about. And so, yeah.
I mean, it's this weird, I was thinking about this a lot recently, and thinking that to some extent, it really does come down to trust. Because, I read, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and I trust that the editors and reporters have done their work, that they have gone back to the fact-based sources, that they've thought about them critically, that they've synthesized and presented it fairly. But it is I can't swear that they've done that. I can't swear that, every news story I read doesn't contain mistakes. And, the Pew Research Foundation or Center recently found that, and this is no surprise, that, Republicans and Democrats place their trust in almost opposite media environments.
Mm-hmm.
Republicans view 22 out of 30 major news sources as untrustworthy, and Democrats exactly the reverse. We know this.
Yeah.
And it's just such a stalemate, because at some point you have to sort of accept the norms of rational, fact-based analysis and storytelling. And to me, that's what has been eroded, even though it seems like the stories, the human stories, are what, going back to that point about empathy, are what we can all relate to, regardless of, where we're coming from.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the only hope for bridging that gap.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure. I attended a sort of a potluck dinner at a compound on the prairie in a trailer. It was like 3 trailers put together with a couple who had, you know, all kinds of to me outlandish beliefs in you know, of the sort that in an educational facility you wouldn't hear, like you know, the British Royal Crown actually owning the U.S. Treasury, or you know, the government, all of the government's nefarious plans in getting all of our pictures and numbers, and anyway, they just believed in the most severe conspiracies. And I said, so okay, so where did you get this? And there's a weak internet signal, and my hostess pulled up a YouTube video of a guy identified as a judge in New Jersey. And I said, oh, I've never heard of him. And she said, well, where do you get your information? And I said, oh, well, New York Times. And the whole room of people laughed. They just all chuckled and looked at me like the most deluded person they'd ever met. And it left a big impression on me about how far we have to go. But I agree with you that evidence-based information, you know, with a source attached to it that you can go back to, a primary source, like we are taught in school, in history class or whatever, look for the primary sources. That I think you can't distance yourself from that. I think it's our only prayer. And you have to believe in science. If you don't believe in science, then anything is possible, right? So
exactly.
Yeah.
Let me go to Katie's question. She says, given the blurred lines between immersion journalism and memoir, do you have thoughts on what distinguishes one from the other?
Sure. So memoir is about me, right? I mean, it's kind of the degree of first person that is a difference. If I'm writing a book about my life or this experience I had, then I am the star of that book. That's appropriate for a memoir. It's not appropriate for an experience I had in order to learn about other people. So I'm not the hero of my book about Sing Sing. This is not look at me and see what I endured. I try to be a guide who focuses on what they see and hear and feel. Maybe with even an emphasis on what they feel, because that matters so much and is so often overlooked in sort of more official things. They're both subjective, right? They're both about impressions. But yeah, that first person character in a memoir is different from the first person in a lot of long form journalism. But they definitely dovetail sometimes, right? There's overlap, and it's a really good question because it's not always clear where the emphasis should be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask Dana's question first, and then the other question we'll come to. Once you've been immersed inside a situation for so long, how do you step outside that to write? And how do you, I don't know if you do, remove your emotions from the story?
So you go home, which is an indispensable step, because your home is the place your writing from. And it's like if you come back from a trip, you start writing when you get home. You take notes while you're on the trip. You send postcards, you send emails, you post on Instagram, but you wait till you're home to put it all together and organize it. And so it's funny, I often think that an immersion experience is like when I'm in this another world, it's like there's a rubber band of my identity that's getting stretched as I learn to work in a meat packing plant, or learn to stay safe in prison, or anything like that. And I come home and I'm looking at all my notes and I'm feeling that rubber band go back, but it doesn't go back to exactly where it was. And I want the writing to reflect that difference between where it was when I started and where it is now. And I want it to account for that change. I want to explain how that happened and where it's left me. And mostly it's left me in a better place, but not always. You know, there's things that you kind of wish hadn't happened to you, and some of them are important to write about. Anyway, I sometimes think of what you know, the phrase participant observation from social science. It describes, you know, the field method of starting here as an observer and wanting to move over here as a participant. So anybody could start here, and you want to get over, but you don't want to go all the way, because that's going native, right? That's losing your perspective. And this distance is both a disadvantage when you start out. You want to get closer, but it's also what empowers you to then offer a version of this experience. It's your distance is what you need at that point. So yeah, there's a great tension between how close where you begin and then where you got to.
That's a great image. That's very helpful.
Thanks.
I think we have time for one last question. Could you tell us more about your current project? I guess you're in rural Colorado.
Yeah, so I grew up in Colorado, and my third book is about Aspen, actually, where I thought it would be interesting to see if you could do ethnography among rich and famous people. I lived there a couple years, but then moved to New York, and my family in Colorado includes a sister who visited lots of parts of the state working for a foundation, and she told me about how people had started living off-grid in this giant valley that extends into New Mexico called the San Luis Valley. And the pictures she showed me were like from Appalachia or something, just a sort of degree of isolation, and much more actually than West Virginia, like being alone in the middle of nowhere, and but in an incredibly beautiful place. And I was intrigued by what that must be like, and learned there was a group that ran sort of a rural homeless shelter in the biggest town in the valley. And I went to visit them and asked if I could volunteer with their rural outreach initiative that like tries to keep these off-grid people from becoming homeless and having to give up. Mm. And they said, yeah, that'd be great. And so I did two things at once. I started going out with other volunteers and just going out alone and approaching these isolated people, many of whom do not wish to be approached, to see if they needed clothing, firewood, food. And if I got to know them, I would also say, and by the way, I'm a writer. Could I interview you? Could I talk to you about living out here? That's how I started. I then actually bought some land a couple years ago with an old trailer on it, which I've been fixing up. So I'd have more skin in the game, if you will. And yeah, so that the story takes me from New York to this opposite of New York in terms of density and politics and income and everything else. And the good thing is I really like being out there. I like the different kinds of people I meet, and the different kinds of problems they have to figure out. You know, when they run out of power from their cheap solar panels, or they run out of water, or the neighbor's horse comes over and breaks their fence, or a guy selling meth is pursued by 8 police cars and rolls over on the main road. There's just all kinds of stuff that is not part of my life here in New York. And so, yeah,
To say the least. Yeah.
I wrote about it for Harper's about a year and a half ago, and I'm finishing up a book that I hope will come out next year.
That's great. And so you've been out there during the pandemic, or mostly writing from home?
Mostly writing from home, but I actually felt emboldened by getting vaccinated last month, and returned home last night on a 2 full airplane. But I had some questions I had to answer, so.
Cool. Yeah, we're now allowed to travel. Actually, the CDC just announced today that if you've been vaccinated, you can travel. So it's happening. This has been great. I could talk all day, but I think in the interest of this being people's lunch hour, we will wrap up. Thank you so much, Ted, and thanks to Denison and NYU, and to all of you for joining us. I hope you'll read the works of Ted Conover. There's a link to his website at the top of the chat window, where you can find lots of links to short pieces of journalism that are online, as well as to his books. And again, this program will be shared to the AMS, the Association of Marshall Scholars YouTube channel. And we encourage you to subscribe and to share and to stay tuned for our upcoming events in the Marshall Arts and Humanities series. Thanks so much to Nell Breyer from the AMS as well, for pulling all of this together. We couldn't do any of it without Nell. So thank you very much, and happy Easter weekend.
Thank you very much, Nell. And thanks, Margot.
My pleasure.